Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. Now I should be making the most of this fading and elegant season and also preparing for next year. Carol's got some great advice on how to take your garden with you when you move house.
For me and lots of other people I know, plants are more important than any piece of furniture. But by using the right techniques, you can very quickly turn your new garden into a home from home.
And Joe is visiting what I think is one of the best combinations this country has to offer of architecture and planting.
Every time I come here, it gets my gardening blood flowing. It's fantastic, and I love it.
One of the many things I like about September is that the relationship between things to enjoy in the garden and things to do is very nicely balanced, because the garden is never so full as now. And there's nothing really pressing. It's not like April, where you feel the jobs just have to be done to get on, or even as you go into October and November and you've got to get things done before winter. Now's a time of year when there's masses to enjoy and not too much to do, and a lot of tweaking around. Now, all I have to do here in the dry garden is cut away anything that doesn't look good now, because actually, as a rule of thumb, if it doesn't look good now, it's not going to get any better over the coming months. I'm afraid this is it, but there isn't a lot of it. Just a few sort of deadheads or aquilegias here that have got pretty manky cardoon leaves that could come off. You know, that is not going to look any better in November than it does now. However, the good news is, and particularly here in the dry garden, is that most of this will get better and better over the coming months, because it gradually becomes statuesque and stately as winter comes in and strips it of all its green. And then it gets frosted and the seed heads look really clear, and the birds of course love it. And because this is grown on poor soil, these plants are tough. That means they're growing strong, they're growing upright, they're not flopping all over the place, they're not bashed by wind. So this is actually a very good winter garden. And it's a good tip. If you've got poor soil, it's going to limit your choice of plants and limit how they grow. But if they do adapt, they will survive very well into autumn and winter. Just a little bit of tidying up, and that's all I have to do. I like the way that this mullein is holding well on this poor soil. It's standing up. It's not a thing of great beauty, but it will get better, and it will gradually and elegantly decay, and the birds will perch on it, and it will sway, and it will get frosted. And talking about frosted, all these umbellifers, of course, the fennel and the teasels with their heads, perfect for autumn and winter weather. And I like the grasses too, and the grasses in this soil grow very, very differently than they do in another part of the garden which has got richer soil. This is Miscanthus malpartus, which opens out like that, and then the seed heads will fall. Really looks good. September is a really good time to be planting bulbs. Now, we tend to think about bulbs as being for sunny, well-drained places, but there are a group that will do perfectly well in light shade, in woodland in fact. Oh, you've dropped your apple. Nigel, by the way, regards apples as balls that grow on trees. And I'm converting the copse into a woodland garden. Doesn't mean a huge change. I'm not going to dig it all up. I'm going to plant into the ground. There are masses of primroses and bluebells and wood anemones, but I'm just adding to the planting and also adding variety. And of course, all the plants must be adapted to growing in light shade. And the first is Erythronium, dog's tooth violet. And the reason it's called dog's tooth violet is, and it just so happens we have a dog here to show, pretty similar, Nige. They're long and they look just like a dog's canine. But they're a bulb that can be planted like any other. Just budge a minute, can you move? No, obviously not. I'm going to plant them here. You're not supposed to be doing this. You're not supposed to be. So if I plant a batch here, working between the tree roots, put them in fairly far apart, because this particular variety, which is White Beauty, have quite big leaves, and the leaves are very decorative too, so you don't want to crowd them all out. One of the things I love about bulbs is actually you can buy quite a lot for not very much money, so you get a decent effect. Remember the rule of planting any bulb: you can scarcely be too deep, but you can plant too shallow. Deeper the better, really, and at least twice its own depth. So on a long bulb like that, you want to dig a hole quite deep. And September, early October is a really good time for any bulb planting, for spring flowering bulbs that is, because they start growing, well, in case of daffodils, as early as late August. And the longer they have to grow in the ground, the bigger and the healthier the plant will be, and the better flowers you will get next spring. The only bulb that you can and indeed should plant late, and by late I mean November, December, is a tulip. Now, I love dogtooth violet, and they're special plants, but I have to confess they're not as special as these. This is Trillium grandiflorum. Now, Trillium is one of those plants that has charisma. It's special. It's called Trillium because it's got 3 petals, 3 sepals. North American plant, likes dappled shade, perfect for here. And this will grow with a white flower, grow to over a foot tall, which in spring flowering terms gives it stature. This is a plant that stands out above the crowd. Now, it's quite expensive, £2.50 for each of the rhizomes, and I'll show you. They don't look very dramatic like this, but that will become something very special indeed, so it's worth investing in. Do try and add some leaf mould to the soil if you can. And then don't bury the rhizome too deeply, but just cover it up with a couple of inches of soil and mark the spot so you don't disturb it. Now, obviously, there's nothing to see now. This is all about the future, next year, and actually probably the year after that and the year after that before they really look their best. But when you move home, you do have to leave plants you love behind. But not always.
For each and every one of us, our garden's a very special place. And they're full of memories too. Lots of plants represent people or occasions, things we've been given or that we can remember in our mum's gardens. But what happens if we decide to move house? We've got to leave our plants where they are, but there are still ways and means to ensure that we bring parts of those plants with us to a new home. One of the letters we've had is from Elaine Ford and her husband, who are moving house from Surrey to Devon. She's been taking loads of cuttings, but she specifically wants to know what to do to make sure that the lavender cuttings she's taken get off to a flying start in their new home. Well, these are the lavender cuttings that I took, and they've made fine bushy little plants, and they should be very, very well rooted. Oh, look at that. Now, I could just leave them in this little pot, but if I pot them on into something bigger, it means that they're going to be much, much bigger plants by the spring. Just trying to ensure that they keep as much root with them as possible. And I'm going to put them into a bigger pot. Now, the whole idea of doing this is they've got a couple of months now where they can grow and really make fairly rapid sort of growth. And then they can stay in those pots over winter and go out into the garden or be potted on again. If I nip these tops and remove some of these cuttings from around the edge, just taking the top couple of inches from them, it's going to mean that all those little side shoots are going to make big laterals, and the whole bush is going to be really big and shrubby by next spring. And the advantage of that is I'll get masses more flowers. If I ever had to move house, there's one plant that I just have to bring with me, and that's this beautiful white phlox. I use it all the way through this bed, and it's got huge sentimental value. My mum Jeannie gave me a bit of this when we first came to the garden, and I couldn't really take cuttings from it now, but there are so many other perennials in the garden that are just ripe for taking cuttings. Don't you just love this gorgeous dark plant? It looks like chocolate, and that's its name. Ageratina altissima chocolate. Altissima meaning it's tall and it's really chunky. And these plants have only been in these new beds for a year. They were tiny little plants when I put them in, and they themselves were grown from cuttings. I can raid this without it having any adverse effect at all. And it's not just this plant that you can take cuttings from. There are loads of them. Things like penstemons. You might have to use a knife if you're actually taking cuttings from a big shoot on a penstemon, or you can pull off little side shoots like this. Asters, you can leave them right over the winter. Take them with you in the spring, pot them up, and then put them out later into your garden. It's easy, really. Although there are all sorts of plants that you can grow from cuttings, and it's a really exciting way of making more plants, there's one way that's even more time-honoured, and that is collecting seed. It's the easiest way to move your plants from one garden to another. In these big pots here, I've got all manner of annuals. They look a bit scruffy now, because with both my Cerinthe and these lovely calendula, I've not deadheaded them for weeks now because I've wanted them to make seed. And they have. The seeds on Cerinthe are big and black, very, very obvious. And they're the ideal thing if you've got a family, for little hands to come and collect and to take part of their old garden into their new garden and sow themselves. Moving house can be one of the most stressful events in anybody's life, but it can also be one of the most exciting. For me and lots of other people I know, plants are more important than any piece of furniture. But by using the right techniques, by taking cuttings, making divisions and collecting seeds, you can very quickly turn your new garden into a home from home.
Sometimes you find yourself salvaging plants, not to take from one garden to another, but within your own garden. And that's the case this year for me with Verbena bonariensis. Now last summer, the jewel garden was full of it. We had great clouds of its lovely flowers, which of course are so good for butterflies. And they just love these little florets held on the stems. It's a plant that comes from the pampas of Argentina and stands out, and is perfect for a border because you can mingle it with almost anything and it works its way through and doesn't get shielded by it, which is why I want more. And we did have lots of seeds, and I think the fact we put a really thick mulch on stopped them germinating, whereas in the grass borders which we didn't mulch, it has come back. Now I shall sow seed next spring, and it grows very well from seed. And I might even dig up a few of the plants, particularly the smaller ones, and overwinter them in the cold frame so that they can be planted out after we've mulched next year. But I'll also take cuttings, and you can take cuttings at this time of year from Verbena bonariensis very easily. Now what we're looking for are side shoots. So not the main stem, but the shoots that grow between the main stem and a leaf. Now here's one coming out, but this is too big. And this ends in a flower, so you want one without a flower. Never take a cutting with a flower on the end. But off this side shoot are further side shoots. So there's one there, and that will make good cut material. And with side shoots like this, you can either peel them off, or you can cut them. And there we are. That just pulls off without any problem at all. That's the sort of size of verbena cutting I like to take. Ideally that or even a little bit bigger. Now the routine for taking cuttings is becoming pretty established. Just some really good, well-drained compost. I've run out of grit, so I'm using perlite. And act fast. So take your cut material out, strip off the lower leaves, you don't want to leave too many. Pop them in. These should establish roots within a few weeks, but they will wilt fast if you don't keep them nice and moist. So if you've got a propagator, well worth it. If you haven't, you could consider putting a plastic bag around them, although there is always a risk of it getting too wet in there, or just mist them 2, 3 or even 4 times a day. And you can see I'm not cutting the end. If you cut them cleanly beneath a leaf node. Right. Now I'll do the others in a minute, but that really does need to be kept moist. And as I've got a propagator, I'm going to put it in, because in this weather that will just go flop and may well never recover. Now you may not be considering doing any cuttings this weekend, but here are some other things that you could be doing. Now other than cut the grass and collect the fruit, we pretty much let the orchard do its own thing. But Joe's been to a garden that is much more structured. In fact, I think it's a brilliant combination of tight architectural structure and loose planting.
5 years ago, Hestercombe in Somerset became an RHS partner garden. To be one, the garden has to fulfil 3 conditions. It's got to be a good horticultural standard, a great visitor experience, and inspirational to gardeners. Hestercombe's 18th century landscape is certainly impressive, but within its grounds is an Edwardian gem that I know well and absolutely love. I first came here about 20 years ago, well over 20 years actually, and the garden just blew me away. And it was pretty much there and then that I decided that I wanted to be a professional garden designer. At the time, this was the most impressive and inspirational garden I had ever seen. It was completed in 1906 by British architect Edwin Lutyens and doyenne of garden design Gertrude Jekyll. Lutyens was famous for his arts and crafts buildings that imaginatively refashioned English country houses with romantic and medieval features. Jekyll was famous for her flowing cottage garden style and skilled use of colour. She introduced Lutyens to many garden projects, and Hestercombe is considered to be their finest collaboration. When I first came, I was so lucky. I had the place to myself, the sun was setting, the light was absolutely magical, and I felt myself being breathlessly drawn through the garden into certain rooms and then looking along vistas and wanting to go there. But it was only after I'd left the garden that I realised I had no control over it. I was being manipulated by Edwin Lutyens and Gertrude Jekyll. They were doing it to me, and I didn't even know it. I just love all the stone detailing in this garden. It's so beautiful. A really good example of this local stone, it's called Mort Slate, and then this is just absolutely classic Lutyens set of steps, the way they fan out concentric circles, but they've been softened by Gertrude Jekyll's planting. I mean, lovely cerastium and fleabane softening the rises, but still keeping it practical because you can walk all the way up them. And the whole composition is just so pretty. For 60 years, the garden was left to crumble until the Hestercombe Gardens Trust took it over in 2003. All the stone in the garden has recently been restored, but the planting was something of a mystery until Gertrude Jekyll's plans were discovered. Head gardener Claire Reed has brought some copies to show me. Where did they come from?
They were found in the sort of gardener's mess hut, left abandoned there really. So we've been really lucky because we've been able to work with them as much as possible. We've had to change a few things. For instance, the huge cannas that you can see here in the sunken garden, which we call the Great Plat, they're actually meant to be variegated maize, and we ordered the seed in from France and we grew these maize, but because we're in Somerset, the badgers just went for them. So that's our change, really.
And what about the gladioli? Because they're quite stunning, really. Was that one of her colours?
Yeah.
That salmon pink gladioli?
Yeah, lots of people think that we've done this wrong often, because people think of Jekyll as being the sort of soft hues and muted tones and sort of graduating colour.
Yeah.
But here she described it in her book as vibrating colours.
And also another point is that she didn't have that wider range of plants that we have today either. It was much more limited, wasn't it?
No, it was a limited palette, but I suppose in a way that's what gives you the balance around the garden. If you're only using a smaller palette, you're not sort of bombarding the eye with lots of different things.
Yeah.
It's probably a good way of designing.
There are details in the garden that hint at Lutyens and Jekyll's teamwork. Lutyens left holes in the walls to enable Jekyll to plant them up, and a glorious pergola that lures you around the far reaches of the garden. I love this pergola. It's about 200 feet long. Apparently it's one of the longest pergolas in the UK. And I love the way the lavenders just billow over the paving either side of it. Just lovely and soft, but the eye's drawn right through the middle. The garden faces onto open countryside, cleverly drawing you away from the austere Victorian building. However, much of the view is blocked by walling and the pergola, but the design allows you to get glimpses through the gaps and apertures that intensify the views beyond. You're not quite sure what you're going to see until you get there. There's always this excitement of what's around the next corner. And there you go. Oh, look at that. Isn't that just beautiful? The lawns either side and the rill right up the middle drawing your eye, and you're not disappointed when your eye gets there. That's the thing. It's exciting to walk around this garden as it twists and turns and delights, and it's a confident design by two people at the height of their creativity. Every time I come here, it gets my gardening blood flowing. It's fantastic, and I love it.
I love Hestercombe too, and I do feel that Lutyens is one of the great unsung heroes of garden design. But I bet he never dug his own garden. And I'm digging the beds for the white garden, which will fundamentally be planted up this autumn and next spring. But preparing the soil is the key to it. Your plants are only as good as the soil, so that the better you can get it, the better the plants will be. It's really a very simple equation. But of course, you can't change your soil. It has a character. And it's important to know what it's like. And digging is certainly a very good way of finding out. This is a clay loam. As far as I know, it's never been dug before. So that it needs breaking up, because it's the structure that matters more than the fertility. See, look, this has come away in a slab. So my soil is fundamentally clay that holds together. And if I drop it, it won't break apart much. In fact, if I leave that all winter, the rain and the cold and the wind will break it down. And you'll be amazed how next March or April that will be lovely, crumbly tilth. But if you're not certain how to tell, take a handful of soil and first of all hold it in your hand. Toss it about. If it holds together, it's likely to be clay. If that was a sandy soil, it would break up. I have to really squeeze that to break it. Now this is a clay loam, which means it's fundamentally clay, but it's mixed in with humus. It's good soil. It's nice stuff. It does tend to be a bit heavy. If it was a sandy loam, it would break up. The particles would be really big. And the danger of that soil is all the water, all the goodness can just leach through it, like a sieve, just pours down out of reach of the plants. So what you need to do then is to open it up, add masses of organic matter, and that holds it and gives it structure and substance. If it's a very heavy clay, the water and the roots can't get in. It's a solid mass. Go on, move yourself. It literally becomes impenetrable. That becomes solid and hard. So we need to break it up, add organic matter so it's loose and open. And that's the real purpose of digging. Get the structure of the soil right, regardless of what its basic character is. Using a spade is a beautifully fine-tuned business. Quite hard work digging this clay. This one, which I love, and I've had about 20 years, is a good example of how the angles all work. So you put it in so it's upright, and automatically that leans the handle away from you. And then when you put your foot on it, all the force is going down. So you go down like that, and it goes down easily. And then in this case, you pull it out, chop down that way, hardly any effort. Again, put it down straight, and then just pull it back towards you, and the soil levers out. And that's easy. A few weeks ago I showed you the effects of blight in this greenhouse. Never had blight in the greenhouse before, and in fact, funnily enough, it hasn't affected the other greenhouse where the tomatoes are absolutely fine. However, I had to pull all these out. We salvaged a lot of the tomatoes, but others had to be burnt too. Now, I've had lots of letters. There's Ron Taylor, sincerely stressed, Kim Bull in Chichester, we've got John Rich, and they've all asked the same thing. How do they deal with the soil or the compost after you've got rid of blighted tomatoes? The truth is there's not too much to worry about, because the blight will only go on living in the soil or compost in living organisms. And that means tomatoes or potatoes. No risk of tomatoes going on living in the soil. There is potatoes, mind you. If you're growing potatoes, you do need to get rid of every scrap and not grow potatoes there next year. But tomatoes in a greenhouse, very, very small risk of the spores living on till next spring. Now, I shall be sowing a sallow crop in here and putting in plugs, because it doesn't transmit to anything other than tomatoes or potatoes. Next spring, I'll probably change the soil, but that's a good idea to do in a greenhouse every 3 years or so to stop the build-up of viruses. And I'll also give it a good scrub. But don't worry, it's not going to lurk in your soil over winter and then destroy next year's crop. That's it for this week. Now, next week, I shan't be here at Longmeadow because we are doing an RHS special. I'll be down at Wisley, Carol will be up at Harlow Car. So we'll see you at our normal time then. Bye-bye.
Against the backdrop of war, passions are stirred in Parade's End, our new drama coming up next. And on BBC4 now, a treat if you love folk music, a profile of Fairport Convention.